Tonight, everything will be rewritten in plain sight." The words echoed softly through the grand Manhattan ballroom, where crystal chandeliers scattered light across polished marble floors, and the hum of high society never truly paused. Daniel Carter stood at the center of it all, a man carefully tailored in confidence, his hand resting possessively at the waist of Victoria Lane, a model whose smile had been trained for cameras and whose presence now symbolized something far more deliberate than romance. Cameras flashed as guests leaned in, sensing the quiet tension beneath the elegance. Daniel raised his glass slightly, not in celebration, but in declaration. "Some chapters close," he said with a calm smile, his voice carrying just enough for nearby journalists to catch, "so better ones can begin." Laughter followed, soft, polished, approved. Victoria tilted her head toward him, playing her role flawlessly, as if she had always belonged there. Yet what lingered beneath the surface was not admiration, but calculation, a carefully constructed rewriting of history where one name was being elevated while another was being erased. Somewhere in that same city, Emily Harper was absent from every frame, every lens, every whispered conversation. Once the woman who stood beside Daniel when there was nothing but ambition and debt, she had become a silence people spoke around but never addressed directly. No invitations carried her name. No headlines mentioned her absence. Still, questions lingered in the margins of every conversation. Where did she go, and why did she disappear so completely? Daniel's gaze briefly drifted across the room, not searching for her, but ensuring she was not there. That absence, intentional or not, had become part of the evening's design. Victoria's smile widened as a reporter asked about the future of Carter Enterprises, and Daniel responded smoothly, "The future is exactly where it should be." Applause followed, controlled and predictable. Yet beyond the glitter of champagne and curated laughter, the air shifted slightly, as if the room itself had begun to anticipate something unspoken. Doors opened and closed in the distance, servers moved through the crowd, and the orchestra adjusted its rhythm. But beneath it all, a quiet imbalance lingered, as though the story being told tonight was incomplete. Daniel lifted his glass again, unaware that absence is sometimes louder than presence, and silence, when sustained long enough, begins to gather weight of its own. In another part of the city, unseen and unmentioned, Emily Harper stood at the edge of a private space preparing for a moment she had not rushed but waited for, her hand resting gently against the subtle curve of her future, her expression calm in a way that no longer asked for permission. But here, in this room of glass reflections and polished reputations, only one version of reality was being celebrated, and it was already beginning to fracture in ways no one was yet willing to name. After the evening inside the Manhattan ballroom began to settle into carefully controlled conversations and polite applause that masked deeper tension, the world of Daniel Carter continued to present itself as flawless on the surface, while subtle fractures formed beneath it. Emily Harper had not appeared at all during the night, and her absence was no longer treated as coincidence, but as a quiet statement that no one wanted to openly interpret. Daniel Carter stood near the center of attention, still surrounded by cameras and influential guests, yet his focus occasionally drifted toward the entrance, as if expecting something that would never arrive. In a separate part of the city, Emily Harper moved through a quiet neighborhood, where morning light replaced the artificial glow of chandeliers, and her life no longer followed the rhythm of high society gatherings. She had learned to live quietly not because she was broken, but because she was rebuilding something no one else could see yet. One afternoon, a message arrived without warning, inviting her to a private meeting that carried no clear explanation, only a name she had never publicly spoken aloud: Alexander Reed. The invitation came from an exclusive aviation terminal where silence was not absence of sound, but presence of control and precision. Emily arrived without announcement, stepping into a space where everything felt larger than expectation, yet quieter than judgment. Inside, she found Alexander Reed for the first time, not as a rumor, but as a presence that changed the atmosphere without effort. He did not ask her questions about the past, nor did he attempt to fill the silence with unnecessary words. Instead, he offered a simple gesture, a seat beside a window overlooking the runway where aircraft moved with quiet authority. Emily sat down, feeling neither invited nor excluded, but observed in a way that did not demand performance. Outside the glass walls, the city continued its endless movement, unaware of the quiet intersection of two lives that had never been meant to cross again. And somewhere between distance and memory, Emily Harper understood that this moment was not an ending, but the beginning of a shift that would soon become impossible to ignore. Daniel Carter remained unaware that the absence he had once treated as victory was beginning to transform into something he could no longer control. Victoria Lane adjusted her posture for the cameras, smiling as instructed, yet noticing the subtle shift in Daniel's attention that she could not fully reach. Rumors began to circulate quietly through the ballroom that an unexpected guest had arrived at the aviation terminal earlier that day. And though no one yet understood the significance of that arrival, the atmosphere began to shift in ways that could not be explained. At the private aviation terminal miles away from the gala lights, a black jet stood ready, its engines silent, but waiting for a passenger who had already begun to change the balance of every room she entered. Unknown to Daniel Carter, the invitation that had reached Emily Harper was not a coincidence, but a carefully timed alignment of paths shaped by Alexander Reed, a man whose influence extended beyond visible wealth into industries that quietly determined the fate of companies, reputations, and futures across the entire country. Tonight itself unfolding right now, the city had already begun to change its rhythm by the time evening returned, as if the hours themselves were aligning toward a moment no one at the center of Manhattan could yet explain. Inside the Carter Enterprises Gala, Daniel Carter remained surrounded by carefully selected allies, the kind of people who smiled at the right moments and applauded at the right sentences. Yet even within that controlled harmony, there was a subtle undercurrent of distraction. Conversations repeated fragments of rumor about an unexpected presence seen earlier at a private aviation terminal, though no one could confirm details with certainty, and Daniel dismissed it with a calm gesture that suggested control, while his attention lingered longer than usual on unanswered questions. Victoria Lane stood beside him in a gown designed for attention rather than comfort, her presence polished and deliberate. Yet even she noticed the small shifts in Daniel's focus whenever doors opened or conversations softened. Across the city, in a quiet residence far removed from the world of glass chandeliers, Emily Harper stood before a mirror, not as someone preparing for spectacle, but as someone preparing for completion, her expression steady in a way that no longer carried hesitation, her hand resting gently near her abdomen, as if acknowledging a truth that required no explanation to anyone else. The room around her was simple, defined not by luxury but by clarity, and every movement she made carried the calm precision of someone who had already survived the part of the story meant to break her. A message arrived moments later, brief and without decoration, confirming that transportation had been arranged and that timing was no longer a matter of choice but alignment, signed only with the name Alexander Reed. At the private aviation terminal, the black jet remained motionless beneath controlled lighting, its presence less like transportation and more like a statement of intent, while Alexander Reed stood nearby reviewing details not with urgency, but with quiet certainty, as though he understood that the evening ahead was not about confrontation but revelation. When Emily arrived at the terminal, she was not greeted with ceremony, but with respect, a subtle acknowledgement of presence rather than status, and Alexander met her gaze without pressure, offering only a simple confirmation that everything was prepared and that nothing would be forced beyond what she was ready to face. Inside the aircraft, the atmosphere was calm, designed for silence rather than conversation, and as the city lights began to fall away beneath them, Emily watched the distance between her past and present widen with every passing mile, not as something she was escaping from, but as something she was finally moving through with intention. Meanwhile, inside the gala, the sense of control that Daniel Carter had maintained began to show its first imperceptible cracks, as more guests whispered about timing, about absence, about the possibility that someone uninvited had already begun to influence events outside the room, and even the orchestral background seemed to shift slightly, as if waiting for a cue that had not yet been given. Victoria's smile remained steady for the cameras, yet her eyes followed Daniel more closely now, noticing how his composure required more effort than before, and Daniel himself found his attention drawn repeatedly toward entrances that remained unchanged, each moment extending the quiet tension that had begun to settle beneath the surface of celebration. Far above the city, Emily Harper sat in silence within the private aircraft, her reflection faint against the window as the world below became a map of lights and distance, while Alexander Reed remained seated across from her, not as a figure of interruption, but as one who understood timing in ways that required no explanation. And as the aircraft continued its steady path forward, the final alignment of events that would soon bring past and present into the same room was already underway. Without a single word spoken aloud, the aircraft cut through the night sky with a steady calm that felt almost detached from the world below, where millions of lives continued their routines without awareness of the quiet convergence unfolding above them. Inside the cabin, Emily Harper sat near the window watching the curvature of city lights dissolve into scattered constellations across the landscape, each passing mile creating a widening distance from the life she once knew but no longer belonged to. There was no anxiety in her expression, only a controlled stillness shaped by experience rather than expectation, as if she had already accepted that certain moments in life do not arrive to be survived but to be understood. Across from her, Alexander Reed reviewed no documents and issued no instructions, his presence defined instead by restraint, a kind of calm awareness that did not attempt to guide her thoughts but allowed them to exist without pressure. When the aircraft began its gradual descent toward a private runway outside Manhattan, the city re-emerged below them not as memory but as consequence, a place where every light represented a decision already made by someone unaware of its broader impact. Meanwhile, inside the ballroom of Carter Enterprises, the atmosphere had shifted subtly in ways no one could fully articulate. As conversations became shorter, laughter less consistent, and attention more frequently directed toward entrances that remained unchanged. Daniel Carter maintained his position among guests, yet his composure now required effort that was becoming increasingly visible to those closest to him, and Victoria Lane, standing beside him, sensed that the narrative she had been prepared to embody was no longer flowing as smoothly as before. Reports moved quietly through select circles that a private aircraft had landed earlier than scheduled at a restricted terminal, a detail dismissed publicly but repeated privately with growing curiosity. Daniel's attention returned again and again to his surroundings, not because anything had changed within the room, but because something outside the room had begun to influence the rhythm of it. The orchestra continued to play with professional consistency, yet even its music seemed to blend into a background that no longer held complete control over the emotional tone of the evening. At the private terminal, Emily disembarked without hesitation, stepping onto polished ground where security and discretion replaced spectacle, and Alexander Reed followed at a measured distance, not leading but aligning with her pace, as though respecting an unspoken boundary. A vehicle waited without insignia, and the journey from the terminal into the city was marked by silence that felt purposeful rather than empty. As they approached Manhattan, the skyline rose gradually into view, its glass towers reflecting fragments of light that seemed to fracture and reassemble with every passing second, and Emily observed it not as a return, but as an entry into a space she had already outgrown emotionally, but had not yet re-entered physically. Inside the gala, Daniel Carter was now engaged in conversation with associates whose words he barely registered, his focus fragmented between appearances and anticipation of something he could not yet define, while Victoria maintained her presence beside him with increasing awareness that attention was beginning to shift away from performance and toward uncertainty. The doors of the ballroom remained closed to change, yet the energy within the room had already begun to adjust, as if responding to an unseen arrival that had not yet been acknowledged. Outside, a vehicle slowed near the building's entrance, its presence unremarkable to those unaware of its significance, but its timing precise enough to alter the structure of what came next. Emily Harper remained inside, composed and steady, as the final distance between absence and presence narrowed into a single moment that had been approaching since the beginning of the evening, without anyone inside realizing it had already started. The moment the vehicle came to a stop outside the Manhattan Tower, the atmosphere inside the gala had already begun to shift in ways that no one could fully name yet, as if the building itself was quietly responding to something approaching from beyond its glass walls. Inside the grand ballroom, Daniel Carter maintained his position among guests, but his attention was no longer anchored to any single conversation. instead fragmenting into brief moments of focus that kept returning to the entrance as though he expected meaning to walk through it at any second. Victoria Lane remained beside him, perfectly composed for the cameras, yet her awareness had sharpened to the subtle changes in Daniel's posture, the way his responses were slightly delayed, the way his confidence required more effort than before. Outside the building, Emily Harper stepped out of the black vehicle without hesitation, her presence unmarked by spectacle but defined by a quiet certainty that did not seek validation from the space around her. The entrance to the tower was controlled, guarded, and designed for exclusivity, yet there was no resistance when her name was confirmed, as if her arrival had already been anticipated long before it physically occurred. Inside the elevator, the ascent was smooth and silent, the mirrored walls reflecting a version of Emily that no longer belonged to the past Daniel remembered, and yet carried none of the aggression or urgency that people often expected from someone returning after absence. Instead, there was stillness, a controlled calm shaped by time and transformation, while each passing floor brought her closer to a room that had already begun to destabilize without her presence inside it. At the top level, the doors opened into a corridor lined with soft light and polished surfaces, where the sound of distant music from the ballroom filtered through like a controlled memory of celebration, and Emily walked forward without rushing, her steps steady as though she had already accepted every possible outcome of what lay ahead. Meanwhile, inside the ballroom, Daniel Carter lifted his glass once more, only to pause briefly as a subtle shift moved through the room, not visible enough to be named, but strong enough to be felt in the pauses between conversations and the direction of wandering eyes. Security personnel exchanged brief, almost imperceptible glances near the perimeter, while a quiet acknowledgement passed through staff who had received instructions that were not shared with guests. Victoria noticed the change first in Daniel's expression, a flicker of attention that no longer belonged to the room itself, and followed his gaze instinctively toward the entrance just as the double doors at the far end of the ballroom remained closed for a final second longer than necessary. Emily Harper stood on the other side of those doors, not yet visible but fully present in the awareness of the space, her reflection faintly visible in the polished surface as she waited for a moment that required no introduction. Alexander Reed stood several feet behind her in quiet alignment, not interfering, not announcing, only confirming with his presence that what was about to happen carried weight beyond social recognition. Inside the ballroom, the music continued, but it now felt thinner, stretched across an expectation that no longer belonged entirely to the celebration. Daniel Carter turned slightly toward the entrance once more, his expression tightening in a way that suggested recognition without certainty, as if memory itself was attempting to form a shape it could not yet complete. And then, without announcement or sound, the doors began to open slowly, allowing the first trace of change to enter a room that had not yet realized it had already been waiting for this exact moment from the very beginning of the night. The doors of the ballroom opened wider, not with dramatic force, but with a slow precision that immediately changed the atmosphere inside the room, as if the space itself had been holding its breath without realizing it. Conversations that had been flowing in soft layers of confidence gradually lost their rhythm, not stopping abruptly, but dissolving into uneven fragments of attention that drifted toward the entrance. Daniel Carter felt it first as a subtle interruption in his awareness, a shift that pulled his focus away from the polished surface of his current reality and towards something that did not yet have form. Victoria Lane noticed his change in posture before she saw anything herself, the slight tightening of his jaw, and the way his gaze stopped moving across the room and fixed instead on a single point near the doorway. Emily Harper stepped forward into full visibility without hesitation, her presence not announced by sound or movement, but by the immediate recalibration of attention within the room, as though every reflective surface had quietly acknowledged her arrival at the same time. She did not look rushed or uncertain, nor did she attempt to draw attention. Instead, she moved with a calm consistency that contrasted sharply with the controlled energy of the gala. Her appearance carried no dramatic gesture, yet the effect of it was immediate and unavoidable, causing conversations to pause mid-sentence and glasses to lower slightly, as recognition or confusion spread across faces that struggled to reconcile memory with reality. Daniel Carter remained still for a moment longer than anyone expected, his expression shifting through a series of subtle recognitions that did not yet settle into understanding, as if his mind was attempting to place her within a version of the past that no longer aligned with the present moment. Victoria's smile began to fade in a way that was almost imperceptible, replaced by a more careful observation of the space between Daniel and the woman who had just entered, sensing that something foundational had already changed without a single word being spoken. Emily continued walking forward, her steps measured and deliberate, carrying no visible urgency, yet drawing undeniable attention from every direction she passed. The room, once defined by its controlled elegance, now felt slightly misaligned, as though the arrival of one person had quietly disrupted the structure of its social order. At the edge of the entrance, Alexander Reed remained partially visible, not stepping forward but ensuring that the presence of Emily Harper was not interpreted as isolation, his calm posture reinforcing an unspoken alignment of authority that few in the room could identify but many instinctively responded to. Daniel finally took a step forward, though it was small and uncertain, more a reaction than an intention, as he tried to bridge the distance between recognition and acceptance. The music in the background continued but felt less connected to the room, as if it had become secondary to something more immediate unfolding in silence. Guests near the entrance began to shift their positions slightly, creating a subtle corridor of space without being instructed to do so, responding instead to the quiet gravity of Emily's presence. She did not acknowledge them individually, nor did she alter her pace, maintaining a steady forward movement that carried her deeper into the center of the ballroom. Every step she took seemed to redefine the balance of attention in the room, gradually moving it away from the constructed narrative that had defined the evening and toward an unfolding moment that no one had prepared for. Daniel's expression tightened again, not in anger but in the strain of confronting something that did not fit within the story he had rehearsed for himself, while Victoria remained beside him but no longer appeared anchored to the same certainty she had carried at the beginning of the night. And as Emily Harper drew closer to the center of the room, the silence that followed her presence became more structured, more deliberate, until it felt less like an interruption and more like the beginning of a complete redefinition of everything that had been established before her arrival. The silence that followed Emily Harper's entrance was no longer empty but structured, as if the entire ballroom had unconsciously reorganized itself around a presence that could not be ignored. Conversations did not resume with their previous confidence. Instead, they fractured into smaller, uncertain exchanges that lacked the earlier rhythm of control. Daniel Carter stood at the center of it all, no longer fully anchored to the image he had maintained throughout the evening, his gaze fixed on Emily as she continued her steady approach through the crowd. Victoria Lane remained beside him, but the role she had been performing now felt misaligned with the reality unfolding in front of her, her expression tightening slightly as she registered that attention was no longer distributed evenly across the room. Emily's movement did not accelerate or hesitate. It remained consistent, deliberate, and quiet, drawing the focus of every reflective surface and every shifting guest without requiring acknowledgement. As she came closer to the center of the ballroom, Daniel's earlier confidence gave way to something more uncertain, a visible struggle between recognition and disbelief, as though his memory was attempting to reconcile two versions of a person that no longer aligned. He took another step forward, this time more controlled but still hesitant, narrowing the distance between them as the space around them seemed to contract under the weight of collective attention. Victoria's presence, once carefully positioned for visibility and influence, now felt secondary in the unfolding moment, and even she could sense that the structure of the evening had shifted beyond her control. Emily finally slowed her pace as she reached a point where the distance between her and Daniel became defined not by physical space, but by emotional history, and she stopped without ceremony, standing with a calm that carried no urgency or expectation. Daniel looked directly at her now, his expression holding a mixture of shock and recognition that had not yet settled into speech, as if the reality in front of him required time to process before language could form. Around them, guests began to reposition subtly, their attention no longer divided among conversations, but concentrated entirely on the center of the room, where the past and present had collided without warning. The music continued, but it felt detached, almost distant, like a background layer that no longer matched the emotional intensity of what was unfolding in silence. Emily did not speak, nor did she gesture, instead maintaining a composed stillness that seemed to hold more authority than any declaration could have achieved in that moment. Daniel's posture shifted slightly as he tried to maintain composure, yet the confidence that had defined him earlier in the evening was no longer fully accessible, replaced by the need to understand what could not be immediately explained. Victoria glanced between them, her earlier certainty dissolving into uncertainty as she realized that her position in the narrative had been reduced to the periphery of a much larger shift. Emily's gaze remained steady, not confrontational but final in its clarity, as if she had already crossed a threshold that others were only now beginning to perceive. The room itself felt narrower, as though the distance between every person had been reduced by the intensity of focus at its center. And even those who had no understanding of the history between them could sense that something irreversible was taking shape. Daniel opened his mouth slightly as if to speak, but no words followed, and in that moment the imbalance of power within the room became unmistakable, not through action or declaration, but through the simple presence of someone who no longer needed permission to exist in the space she had just re-entered. The moment felt suspended in a silence that was no longer fragile but fully formed, as if the entire ballroom had been reshaped by the simple fact that Emily Harper was standing at its center. Daniel Carter remained locked in place, his expression caught between recognition and disbelief, as though every version of the past he had constructed was being rewritten in real time by the presence in front of him. The confidence that had defined him earlier in the evening no longer held its structure. Instead, it appeared in fragments, visible only in brief attempts to reassert control through posture and breath. Victoria Lane stood beside him, but the distance between them had become more than physical. It was narrative, as if the role she had been placed into no longer aligned with the direction the room itself had chosen to take. Emily did not move closer, nor did she step back. She simply remained where she was, allowing the weight of attention to settle naturally around her without effort or resistance. Her calm was not performative, it was absolute, shaped by time and silence rather than reaction, and it created a contrast that made every other presence in the room feel slightly unstable. Daniel finally spoke, his voice measured but strained, attempting to reclaim familiarity through language, yet the words that followed carried hesitation that revealed more than they concealed. Around them, guests remained silent, not out of instruction but out of instinct, as if speaking would disrupt something they did not yet understand. The orchestra continued its performance, but the sound now felt distant, almost disconnected from the emotional reality unfolding beneath it. Emily's gaze remained steady on Daniel, not searching for approval or explanation, but holding a clarity that suggested she had already moved beyond the need for either. Victoria shifted her stance slightly, her composure still intact on the surface, yet visibly affected by the realization that attention no longer responded to intention alone. Daniel took a step closer, closing the gap between them by a small margin, but the movement did not restore authority, it only highlighted uncertainty. Emily did not react to the step. Instead, she maintained the same steady presence, as if the distance between them had already been defined long before this moment and could no longer be altered by physical proximity. A subtle movement occurred near the entrance as Alexander Reed appeared more clearly within view, not interrupting, not announcing, but standing with a quiet certainty that changed the perception of the entire space. His presence did not draw attention away from Emily, but instead reinforced the sense that what was unfolding extended beyond personal history into something larger and more structural in nature. Daniel's eyes shifted briefly toward Alexander, a flicker of recognition forming without full understanding, as if a missing piece of context had just entered the frame too late to prevent its impact. Emily finally spoke a few words, her voice calm and controlled, not raised and not softened, simply present, and the effect of her voice was immediate in its ability to refocus the room without effort. The guests did not react outwardly, but their attention tightened further, drawn into the space between the three figures at the center. Victoria's expression shifted subtly, the first visible sign that her confidence in the evening's narrative had begun to fracture under the weight of events she had not been prepared to interpret. Daniel listened without interruption, his posture still attempting stability, but the foundation beneath it no longer responded in the same way it had earlier in the night. Emily's words were not elaborate, yet they carried the kind of finality that did not invite negotiation, only recognition. The space between them felt increasingly defined not by emotion but by outcome, as though something irreversible had already been established and was now simply becoming visible to everyone present. And as the silence deepened once again, it became clear that the center of the room no longer belonged to the past that had been remembered, but to the present that was now fully in control of its own direction. The silence that followed her words did not break, it settled deeper, as if the entire ballroom had finally accepted that what was unfolding could no longer be reversed by denial or distraction. Daniel Carter stood still for a moment that felt longer than anything he had experienced that evening. His expression no longer shaped by confidence or performance, but by the slow realization that the structure of his certainty had shifted beneath him without warning. Emily Harper remained exactly where she was, not advancing and not retreating, her presence steady in a way that made every previous version of the narrative feel distant and fragile. Around them, guests no longer whispered out of curiosity, but out of recognition that they were witnessing something that would outlive the event itself in memory. Victoria Lane, still positioned beside Daniel, adjusted her posture slightly as the attention that had once followed her effortlessly now felt displaced, as though the room had quietly reassigned its focus without asking permission. Alexander Reed stepped forward by a small distance, not into confrontation but into visibility, and that simple movement was enough to shift the perception of every observer who understood even partially the weight of influence he carried beyond the walls of that ballroom. Daniel's eyes moved between Emily and Alexander, the connection between them forming a realization that did not need to be spoken to be understood, and in that realization something in his composure finally loosened. Emily's gaze did not change, it remained composed and final, not driven by anger or sentiment, but by clarity that had already resolved itself long before this moment arrived. When she spoke again, her voice carried the same calm precision, not rising above the room, but cutting through it in a way that required no amplification. There were no accusations in her words, no need for justification, only acknowledgement of what had already been lived and what could no longer be rewritten. Daniel listened without interruption, and for the first time that evening he did not attempt to respond immediately, as if understanding that any immediate reaction would only diminish the weight of what he was finally seeing. Victoria's expression softened into something closer to uncertainty than confidence, her earlier certainty dissolving into the recognition that she had been positioned inside a story that was no longer centered around her role. The guests remained still, their attention no longer divided, their collective focus forming a single quiet line directed toward the center of the room, where past and present had fully converged. Alexander Reed did not speak, but his presence confirmed what words would have only simplified, that Emily Harper was no longer returning to a former life, but standing beyond it. Daniel finally lowered his gaze slightly, not in defeat, but in acceptance of a truth that no longer required resistance. And in that gesture the dynamic that had defined the evening reached its conclusion, without spectacle or collapse. Emily turned her head slightly, not away from him, but beyond him, as though her attention had already moved forward to a space that no longer required explanation. The atmosphere in the ballroom softened, not because tension disappeared, but because resolution had been reached in a form that did not depend on noise or reaction. One by one, guests began to understand that what they had witnessed was not a confrontation but a completion, a quiet restructuring of power that had taken place without disruption. Emily Harper took one final step, not toward anyone but toward the path ahead of her, and in doing so she closed the distance between what had been taken from her and what she had already rebuilt. Behind her, Daniel Carter remained standing, not erased, not destroyed, but fundamentally repositioned within a story that no longer